Welcome to week one. Now we're going to talk about the foundations of American law. Many of you already know this, and it may be a review, but it's important for you to understand this for purposes of business law. There are essentially four sources of American law. They are Constitution, statutes, regulations, and what's called common law. Those are the four sources of American law. The easy way to understand these is where they come from. The Constitution is a manifestation of the people's will. Therefore, it's at the top of the rung. Second is statutes. These statutes are a manifestation of legislative power. Therefore, the statutes on the local level, they're called ordinances. Third are regulations, whether on the state, federal, or local level, you call them regulations. These are a manifestation of executive power. And then finally, we have common law. Now, common law is a manifestation of judicial power, and these are court decisions that have accumulated over time and create a basis for many of the areas of American law we're going to be talking about, like contracts, torts, property law, things like that. Understand how they relate. The top of the heap is the U.S. Constitution. And so if Congress is acting within the scope of its enumerated powers set forth in Article 1, Section 8, they control. Think of immigration law, treaties, things like that. Congress controls. And that trumps state and local law. So federal law is supreme, and you'll see this under the federal supremacy provision here. The assumption is that if the federal government, Congress, acting within the scope of its authority, has occupied a field, or if the Constitution gives Congress that authority, they control. They're supreme. Understand the classifications of law. There's a couple great videos on this with respect to criminal, civil, public, private law. Take a look at that. Make sure you understand that. Police power. This is a very powerful tool state and local governments have with respect to creating and enforcing laws that affect public peace, health, and safety. Very broad authority, regulatory authority local governments have in this regard. Finally, make sure you understand the Bill of Rights. These are the first 10 amendments, I should say, on the U.S. Constitution. It's important to understand these limit congressional power, limit what Congress can do. So it protects you from government. It doesn't protect you from other people, from other private individuals. So keep that in mind when you read the Bill of Rights. The Declaration of Rights, this refers to state constitutions where every state has a Declaration of Rights very similar to the Bill of Rights, but goes beyond the Bill of Rights. It goes into far more detail on for example, the state of Washington has a very specific provision on protecting people from invasion in their private affairs. You won't find the word privacy in the federal Constitution. That's been interpreted by court decisions, by common law. So keep all that in mind. And how that applies to business, because if you're a corporation, you have these rights, and obviously individuals have these fundamental constitutional rights. All right, we're now going to talk about, in Chapter 2, courts in what's referred to as ADR. ADR refers to alternative dispute resolution. This is big, in that, for the most part, businesses don't want to be in court for a number of reasons. There's the risk, there's the cost, there's the time. Most businesses nowadays are putting in their contracts what's called an ADR clause, which says to the other party, if you've got a problem, we're going to go to alternative dispute resolution, mediation, arbitration, something like that. So these are extremely common. Now, important to understand with respect to the court system itself is how both systems are set up. It's like a parallel system. There's specialized courts of limited jurisdiction. There's a general trial court normally. There's then the appellate court. So in the federal system, obviously the U.S. Supreme Court is number one. It's the top of the heap. The circuit courts are the appellate courts. The U.S. district courts are where the courts essentially of general jurisdiction, although the jurisdiction is limited, and I'll talk about that momentarily. And then the specialized courts like bankruptcy, if you've got trademark or copyright issues, things like that, there are specialized courts, or tax issues, there are specialized courts for that. The state court system, similar setup. Most states have courts of limited jurisdiction like small claims, or in the state of Washington we have what's called local district courts, which adjudicate disputes under certain financial amount, small criminal cases like misdemeanors and gross misdemeanors. And then our court of general jurisdiction in the state of Washington is called the Superior Court. If you appeal from that, there's a Court of Appeals, and finally the state Supreme Court. Jurisdiction, very important for you to understand that term, and it's basically a formula. This is how it works. Jurisdiction, you first ask yourself, what is the subject matter of the dispute? Is it a constitutional issue? Is it a contract issue? Is it a tort? And you'll understand what torts are momentarily. What's the nature of the dispute? So once you have that nailed down, then the question becomes, does this court have jurisdiction over the person? Does the person live here? Does the corporation do business here? Or the thing. So the formula is subject matter jurisdiction, what is the subject, and either person or thing. So you can have a lawsuit fighting over a piece of land in a county like here in the state of Washington, even if the parties live elsewhere. In federal court, I should say that when I mentioned they have more or less limited jurisdiction, this is how it works. In federal court, the only way you get in federal court are two ways you get there. One is it's got to be a federal question, which means there's some federal constitutional issue at stake, or a federal statute or regulation. The other way you get there is called diversity, and that's where people live in different states, but the amount at issue is more than $75,000. That's diversity jurisdiction. You'll see in your book they talk about concurrent jurisdiction, so you can adjudicate a federal question in state court, but you can't adjudicate a bankruptcy case in state court. That's exclusive jurisdiction to the federal system. All right, due process, a couple of points about due process. Pay attention to the Fifth Amendment, references due process with respect to Congress. Your life, liberty, and property cannot be taken without due process of law. That is also echoed in the 14th Amendment, which applies to the states. Substantive due process is essentially the language of the statute itself. Is it clear? If it's ambiguous or lends itself to arbitrary and capricious enforcement, the statute may violate due process. Procedural due process is the process itself. I mean, how does a case proceed through the system? And you'll see a civil case begins with a summons and complaint. You're summoned to court. You're given time to respond to the complaint, and if you don't, there's going to be a default judgment against you. It's important for businesses to at least understand the basics of this, so you understand how a case proceeds through the court system. And again, I get back to my initial point. This is why businesses don't want to be in court, and there are ways to avoid that through ADR, and that's alternative dispute resolutions. And this is normally, you'll see these in contracts where the parties agree that they will not go to court, they'll waive their Sixth Amendment right to go to court, and in lieu of that, go to like mandatory arbitration. Now this is somewhat of a trap for consumers. If you have a cell phone contract, et cetera, you inevitably have an arbitration clause. You can't sue your cell phone company. And the cell phone company picks the arbitrator, so the chances of you winning are not great. And there's another happy anecdote for you. All right, that's the end of week one, but let me talk about resources first before I move forward. There's a number of great videos and PowerPoints and other resources available via this link here at the top. Just click it and you'll find that there's some great resources that'll help you understand the differences between civil, criminal law, and it's very important to use the proper terminology. If someone's suing you, that's a civil case. If you're being prosecuted, that's a criminal case, and only the government can prosecute you. Private parties don't prosecute. So in a civil case, remember, I'm suing you. I'm looking for the court to find you liable, and for damages. In a criminal case, the government's prosecuting you. The issue is whether you're guilty, not whether you're innocent. It's whether you're guilty and whether the government can prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt for every element of the crime. And then the penalty is potential jail time. How the U.S. Constitution, state constitutions relate, just remember the U.S. Constitution is preeminent. It actually can trump a state constitution that has a conflicting provision. Keep that in mind. We talked about supremacy already, importance of due process, full faith and credit. You'll see that's where other states have to give sister states the full faith and credit of their decisions. So if you get convicted here in Washington and you think you're going to move to Montana and avoid that, that's not going to happen. Commerce Clause, very important. Article 1, Section 8 of the state constitution, the federal constitution talks about Congress has one of the enumerated powers is to regulate interstate commerce. That this is the source of many, many statutes. Now, as we've talked, the hierarchy of American law, a statute has to be based on a constitutional provision. So to be constitutional, and then any regulations adopted pursuant to that statute have to be within the scope of the statute, and the regulation has to be constitutional. So Commerce Clause is very important, source of many of the statutes that are germane to businesses, like anti-discrimination laws, things like that. Let me just add momentarily, your book focuses on federal laws. Remember, states have normally parallel laws that give more rights or even more restrictions than the federal. Think of the federal and state minimum wage laws. Federal minimum wage is at a particular level. States can have higher minimum wage, and even local governments can raise that. So that's something to keep in mind. There's those layers of regulatory impact on businesses. Again, we're going to be focused primarily on civil cases and how they progress and your rights in a civil case. So that's the end of week 1. Hope you enjoy it. Let's move forward to week 2.